Hello, everybody. Thank you for joining us once more on another Images in Focus show. My name is Juan Pons, and with me, as always, is David Swindler. How you doing, David?
I'm doing great.
Excellent. Well, guys, I'm really excited because we're going to be talking all about lenses. This episode is titled Selecting Your Lenses. And we have broken up this show, if you will, into 3 different parts to keep them nice and short for you guys. But without further ado, why don't we get started? Take it away, David.
Sure thing. So the first rule of thumb with lenses is that you want to get good quality glass. That will matter so much in the final output of your photography. And the second rule of thumb is that there are compromises that you're going to have to make. There is no one-size-fits-all lens that's going to work for every purpose. You have to decide what's going to work for my budget. What am I willing to give up when it comes to weight, portability, focal length ranges, and so forth. And then there's other things that come into play too that we're going to talk about, like, what kind of Sunstar quality am I going to get? Or do I care more about how well the lens blurs out my background? So there's lots of things that you have to answer when you're looking for a lens for your specific purpose. The third thing is that this is the place to spend your money. Buying that good quality glass is going to pay many dividends down the road. And lenses are going to hold their value, much more so than camera bodies. Camera bodies come and go. The technology is always improving on these image sensors, the focusing algorithms, and so forth. But you can continue to repurpose these lenses with each additional camera body that you purchase.
Yeah, I mean, that's so true because, camera lenses, we do see camera lenses being revised, right? We've seen with Canon or all sorts of brands where they have a Mark II or Mark III as they go along. But the time span between those lenses being updated is way longer, magnitudes longer than they are on the cameras. Sensors, the development of sensors happens a lot more quickly than it does for lenses. So yeah, those lenses are definitely going to keep, much longer. But you also can get to keep in mind, when those lenses do get updated, to keep an eye out for them, because modern lenses today, especially zoom lenses, are way better than they used to be, right? I mean, the quality is just so much better today because of advances in design technologies for these lenses and materials and whatnot. So it's something to keep in mind. Yes, you do keep them longer, but sometimes you got to give up and, it will be time for updating them.
Absolutely. And many of these new lenses that they're coming out with now are taking into account the high resolution format of these sensors. And so if you're using some of these older lenses, they just were never designed to account for 50 megapixels or 61 megapixels or whatever you're going to be shooting. So you're right in that, there is a time and a place to upgrade your lenses. And we're going to kind of touch on some of those points as we go through this video. So let me give you an example here of camera bodies versus lenses. Back in the day, I was shooting Canon, and the Nikon D800 came out, and everyone was raving about this fabulous image quality and this dynamic range that it had. And so, of course, I had to check it out. So I bought the Nikon D800, and I also had the Canon 5D Mark III. And I went out and did a series of test shots where I was comparing them back to back. And I did this night shoot where I shot these starry night skies with the Milky Way. And when I got home and looked at my images on the computer, the images off this Nikon camera were just fabulous. It was crystal clear. The detail was wonderful. And the images off the Canon camera just looked like crap. And I was like, man, this sucks. Maybe it means I'm going to have to switch completely over to Nikon. Well, I was using the Nikon 14 to 24 millimeter lens on that D800. And on the Canon, I was using their state-of-the-art at the time zoom lens, which was the 16 to 35 millimeter version 2. But then the thought occurred to me, what if it's just the lens that's making that difference and it's not so much the camera body? So I got a little adapter and I put this Nikon 14 to 24 millimeter lens onto the Canon camera body. And I went out and I repeated my experiment. And sure enough, it was all the lens. As soon as I put that Nikon lens on the Canon camera, my images were crystal clear, sharp, they looked great. And so that was a really big learning point for me that yes, camera bodies do matter to some extent, but it's the lens that matters the most.
Absolutely. And, by that time, if I remember correctly, that that Mark II of the 16 to 35, was a few years old. And then, not too long after that, they came up with the version 3. Is that right?
That's correct. Yeah. And the version 3 fixed a lot of those issues. And that's actually a really great lens now to shoot astrophotography with.
Right. And I remember the 1635, both the version 1 and the version 2 on the Canon, they were okay. They were nothing spectacular. So, but yeah, version 3 I know is way, way better than the other two.
Absolutely. And you'll see that reflected in the price points too. And that's one thing with lenses is you often get what you pay for.
Right. And, and that difference, if I remember correctly too, and this is something also to keep in mind with zoom lenses, I think the big difference was on the short end of the range. Like on the long end of the range, the 16 to 35s were actually pretty good at the 35 millimeter range. But when you were down at the 16, that's when they really broke down, right? So that is sort of a lesson as well is, how you're going to use this lens. And when we're talking about wide-angle lenses, we're buying the wide-angle lenses for what? For the wide part, to the short end of the zoom range. So, how it performs in that end is more important than how it performs at the 35 millimeter. Because oftentimes in the long end, you have overlap, right? You may have overlap with a 24 to 105, for example, in that case.
Yes, exactly. So many things to take into consideration. So with regards to lenses, image quality is a very important consideration. And we're going to talk more in depth about these different parameters throughout this presentation. But to give you kind of a higher level overview, one of the first things that we look for with image quality is how sharp is this lens, or what is its acuity. And many lenses can deliver excellent sharpness in the center of the frame, but often that sharpness can fall off dramatically or even precipitously towards the edges or into the corners of that frame. The next thing we look at is what kind of contrast and what kind of color does this lens give us. You can see very different results from the colors that you can get from a scene with one lens versus another. Then the next thing I look at is how much sharpness do I lose if that lens is wide open versus stopped down. And, if I'm shooting mostly landscapes with a lens, then I'm going to be more concerned about how it performs in stopped down mode. But if I'm going to be using a lens for like portraits or wildlife where I'm shooting it really wide open most of the time, then I'm going to be more concerned about the wide open sharpness. The next thing that I look at are distortions. Some lenses have terrible distortions, and if you're going to be shooting like architecture and things like that where you need nice straight lines, well, it's just not going to work very well. Yeah, some of that can be taken out in post, but sometimes it really can't be taken out to your satisfaction. Chromatic aberrations are another thing. We're going to talk about what causes chromatic aberrations and how we can kind of fix that as well. But how much of that you're getting directly from your lens does matter. And finally, there's a whole host of optical aberrations we have to consider. Some of them may matter to your style of photography, others may not matter at all. And then, of course, the amount of vignetting that your lens has will also play a role. There's many more things we can also talk about, but this list is going to be plenty to think about.
Yeah, and the one thing to think about is, as we talked about earlier, the lenses perform differently in different configurations. We talked about, the focal length, right? Some may perform better on the long end versus the short end, or vice versa. But the same thing may happen for example, when you're using the aperture. Some lenses, will be sharper at different apertures than others. Most lenses are not at their sharpest when they're wide open. They're usually sharpest in general 2 stops from wide open. So for example, if you have an f2.8 lens, the sharpest aperture will be, f5.6, because that is giving the lens a little bit more breathing room in the way that they can render the image. So something to keep in mind is that it's not just static. These considerations are not just static. They may depend or change on how you're using the lens.
Absolutely. So what are some of the other things that we look for? Well, one is build quality. I'm sure you're much the same way, Juan, where you're pretty rough on gear, just like I'm rough on my gear. You're rushing around trying to get shots. Things are getting banged around. It might suffer some mild drops from time to time. I need gear that's going to hold up to that kind of abuse. But there's other people that really just baby their gear, and maybe it doesn't even go outside all that often. In that case, build quality may not be such an important consideration. The next thing is weather sealing. Is your camera going to be out there in like the rain and the snow and high winds and things like that? If so, then you're going to want that good weather sealing to keep all the gunk out. The last thing I look for is like focusing speed, and also like the image stabilization that the lens can provide. If I'm shooting just very static scenes, well, then focusing speed is not going to be a primary consideration. In fact, you might even consider just a fully manual lens for certain situations. But if I'm going to be shooting fast action, then I'm going to want a lens that can focus very quickly. I used to have a Sony Sigma 150 to 600 millimeter lens, and I thought, oh, this is an awesome focal range. It's small enough it fits in my backpack, and yeah, it was fine for shooting the elk out there on the ridge. It's just walking along. But as soon as I tried to shoot like a bird in flight or an eagle or something like that, it just could not keep up with the action. So yeah, it was a great lens for that particular price point, but I ended up having to invest in a more expensive lens that would give me the focusing speed I needed.
Yeah, I mean, that's a great point, because a lot of people don't think about that. I see a lot of folks using that lens specifically with wildlife, and if that's all you can afford, that's understandable, but you are going to make compromises, right? In some of the ways that or some of the features that you can look in a particular lens and how it fits within your kit and within your budget. And it's something we're going to talk about a little later in the presentation.
Absolutely. And then the other thing to keep in mind is, what is the internal zoom mechanism? When you zoom in or out with one of these lenses, does it cause the lens body to extend out and compress in, or is it all internally contained? Why would that matter? Well, let's look at this Sony 100 to 400 down here. You can see that when this thing is zooming in and out, this little piece extends. And if you're shooting in like rain, snow, or dusty environments, well, that gunk can get sucked right back into the lens and eventually cause spots and other problems internal to the lens. Whereas if you have a lens like, let's say, this Sony 200 to 600, well, that zoom mechanism is fully contained. The lens doesn't get any longer or shorter when you zoom in or out. So depending on how you intend to use that lens, it may dictate what type of internal zoom mechanism you want to have.
Yeah, I mean, another important consideration from that perspective too is, how that extending lens may change its center of gravity. As you zoom that lens out, for example, that 100, 400, that front part of the lens with some pretty heavy glass elements inside is moving forward. So that's changing the center of gravity of that lens. Why is that important? Is if you're following a subject that's moving, relatively quickly, and you're trying to zoom in or out as that subject is moving, well, guess what? When that center of gravity changes on that lens, it may cause you to lose tracking on that subject. So if it were up to me, I would get all internal zoom lenses if it was at all possible. It's not always possible, but given a choice, internal zoom is going to be far superior than external zoom lenses, for sure.
Absolutely.
Now, another thing to consider is, excuse me, whether you want to choose third party or OEM lenses, or first party lenses as we call them too, whether you want to get a lens that matches your camera brand. So if you're shooting Sony, a Sony lens, or Canon, a Canon lens. And it used to be maybe 10 years ago that this was a huge deal, that the third party companies just didn't produce the same level of quality than the original equipment manufacturers produce. But that is no longer the case, which is a great thing for all of us, because it means there's more selection and more competition in this space. So you consider a third party nowadays will come down to, for example, price and features, all these other things that we're talking about, as well as build quality. Something else to think about is whether you should get a used lens or a new lens. I know I've had pretty good luck in the past with purchasing used lenses, both from individuals as well as refurbished lenses from manufacturers. So Canon, for example, for a long time has had a program where they would list remanufactured lenses for really significant discounts over new lenses. And to tell the truth, every time I bought one of those, I could never tell the difference between it and a newer lens, except for the box that they came in. It came in a brown box versus a box with all the pretty logos and whatnot. And who cares about that? But if you're going to go out and buy equipment from an individual, you just got to be, got to do your due diligence. Be careful. Buy from a trusted source if at all possible. But, you can get some incredible savings. I know that you, David, just recently was able to make some, or realize some really incredible savings by buying a used lens, right?
Yeah, so I purchased the Sony 12 to 24 millimeter lens and knew that's around like $2,600, $2,700. And I ended up picking it up for right around $2,000. And, the guy I purchased it from, I had him send me like sample images. He sent me his original receipt, so it'd still be under like the manufacturer warranty. He sent me the box it came in. And so, if you're buying from someone that you trust and you're going to get a good piece of gear, it's totally worth the savings that you can get.
Absolutely. And, so you could go out and buy from an individual, but also there are companies out there that do sell used gear. B&H and Netorama have a used gear selection, and they do have a pretty generous return policy. So you can receive the lens, look at it, inspect it, try it out, and if it doesn't work, send it back. The real key here is whether you're buying a new lens or a used lens or a refurbished lens from any brand, is that you want to take that lens and test it as soon as possible, so that if it doesn't perform the way you expect it to or way it should, you can send it back in for a refund. Because there's going to be lens variation and variations in lenses, even the same lens from the same company. Like I said, for example, a 24-105. My copy may be a little sharper than David's copy, or David's may focus faster than mine. There may be variation within individual lenses. Now, we don't see that as much as we used to. We used to see that quite a bit with third-party lenses. But the quality control that these companies have instituted are so much better now that you don't see that as often, but it still happens. So you want to go ahead and test out that lens in real-world scenarios, because it's impossible for us to test every single thing in in your living room or in your backyard. Go out, and test it out in the situations you expect to use it, because it's a lot easier to return a lens then have to send it in for warranty service. Even if it's a new lens and it's not performing well, if you have to send in for warranty service, you may end up going back and forth a bunch of times, and it may take longer for them to actually fix the lens, as opposed to just returning a lens and maybe buying another copy. And then the last thing is, you get what you pay for. If it sounds too good to be true, it probably is, as the saying goes. There is a reason why, good quality, well-built, sharp lenses with very few distortion or aberrations cost money, because they do require higher quality components, more engineering. So just keep that in mind, that yes, sometimes we'll be able to save a little bit of money, but you are giving up something somewhere. Just always keep that in mind. Okay. So now the other consideration, something else that we need to think about, is focal length. And this is really highly personal. It depends on the type of photography that you're doing, what your subjects are, again, the type of photography that you do is paramount here. Should you use zoom or prime lenses? I know some people really, really want to shoot with primes. And in a way, I think we all want to shoot with primes, because historically primes have been a lot sharper than zooms. Nowadays, with the new recent technologies in lens design and new materials, the zooms are just incredible. The performance that we're seeing from zoom lenses are just amazing. rivaling, prime lenses. And zoom lenses give you that extra flexibility of being able to zoom in or out. And this is especially crucial for subjects that are not under your control. For example, wildlife. If you're shooting models, for example, you are able to control their distance from where they are and where you are from your subject. With a lot of other subjects, whether they're sports or motorsports or wildlife, you can't control that as much. So having a zoom is an incredible benefit. And for me, because the quality of the zoom lenses has improved so much and they're so good nowadays, most of my lenses end up being zooms. It's just the way it is because they just add that much more flexibility to my shooting style. Mm-hmm. Now, a lot of people say, what zoom lenses should I get? And that really is a personal choice. And it's a discussion that you need to have, with yourself, if you will, trying to figure out the type of photography that you're doing. For example, if you do portraiture or wedding work, you may be looking at lenses, in the, normal, maybe 50 up to a short telephoto lens like a 200. But you certainly wouldn't be shooting with a 600 in normal situations for portraits. But for wildlife, you'll be shooting with a longer lens. And for landscape, you may be shooting with, on the other side of the spectrum, wider angle lenses, 16, 12s, 14s to 35s and whatnot. So it's really about, what your type of shooting is, what subjects you're shooting. There is no best focal length, so to speak. And,
exactly.
You got to think about the ranges that your kit covers. When you start putting together a set of lenses that you're going to be shooting with, what lenses do you need to cover that range that you're shooting for? I know, for example, for me, because I'm primarily wildlife, my lenses, I do have a wide range of lenses, from 16 down to 600. But if you look at my lenses, they kind of congregate more towards the longer end because I shoot more on the longer end. Versus you, David?
Yeah, I tend to shoot, especially in the desert Southwest, I shoot very often with those ultra wides, like that 12 millimeter, 13 millimeter. So really, someone up in Alaska, for example, would probably never shoot with that 12 to 24 millimeter lens unless they're shooting like Aurora Borealis or something where they want just a big swath of night sky.
Yeah, so it's really, at the end of the day, it's really a personal decision based on the type of shooting that you do. The tendency for us is to just accumulate lenses over time, and that's great. But we'll talk about that a little later near the end of the presentation, where you really should consider the kind of lenses that you are taking out in the field with you, and minimize the amount of choices you need to make out in the field. But we'll cover that a little bit later on.
Exactly.
Okay, so when we look at wide-angle lenses, there are a lot of things to consider and a lot of things to think about. Wide-angle lenses, there are so many of them, both in zooms as well as primes. We talked about a little bit as to which way should you lean towards, whether you should lean towards zooms or primes. I think that both David and I are more lean towards the zooms because they offer us a lot of flexibility, a lot of compositional flexibility when we're out there, and the quality is so good. However, one of the drawbacks that I didn't mention earlier about zoom lenses is that they tend to be a little slower than prime lenses. Not always, but they tend to be a little slower. So that's a consideration. Wide-angle lenses, the big thing about them is that they're going to give you a really, really deep depth of field. You're going to have a very short minimum focusing distance. You'll be able to focus to things within sometimes inches of your lens. And with the right techniques, you can get everything in the scene in focus, from the subject that's right in front of you to that distant landscape that's there. So, something to think about as you're selecting wide-angle lenses, how wide do you need to go? How wide of a field of view do you need? How much of the landscape you're trying to keep onto your into your image, and those wide-angle lenses are going to give you that super wide field of view. I mean, that's what these wide-angle lenses are all about. But with that, there are drawbacks to it, right? Wide-angle lenses tend to have more distortions than long lenses. You end up with pincushion distortion, and that's where like the center gets a little bit pinched in, and that usually happens on the longer end of wide-angle lenses, or you may end up with barrel distortion where the center is kind of bulbous and coming out on the image itself, and that usually happens on the wider angle lenses. Like this one that we're showing here in the presentation has a pretty big bulb in the front of the lens, because it's a really ultra-wide lens, but when you're shooting wide with that and you have subjects that are close to you, what you end up having is a little bit of distortion that, some of it can be corrected in post. Actually, you can correct quite a bit in post, but that's another consideration you need to put into place, right?
Yeah, it's all part of this testing those lenses out.
Yeah, absolutely. And you're going to get a lot of that distortion, like I said, in the shorter end of the lenses. Something else to think about is that as we talk about focal length lenses, right, we're talking about, wide-angle lenses are 16, 14, even 12 millimeter lenses. On the wide end of lenses, the millimeters count a lot more than they do on the long end of lenses. So the difference between a 16 millimeter versus a 15, is noticeable, is significant, versus the difference between a 100 and 120 millimeter. There's very little difference between those two. So just keep that in mind as you're thinking of wide-angle lenses. Sometimes that 1 millimeter makes a big difference. And then the other aspect of this wide-angle lens that you really need to think about is filters. If you look at, for example, this lens here that we're depicting, it's got this big bulbous front element. Well, guess what? It's not easy to put a filter on front of this lens. Some of these lenses will have filters that you can put in the back, but that presents a whole other set of challenges. For example, you can't really do polarizers when you put filters in the back because you can't really turn them that easily. At least I haven't seen any that allow you to do that on the short end. I know on the long end, the drop-in filters are a thing on the long end lenses, but not so much on the shorter end lenses. So something to think about as you're buying lenses. For some of these super ultra wide lenses that have these big front, if you want to apply a filter to that, the filter is going to be, massive and very expensive.
Yeah, we're talking like 150 millimeter big, and that's a lot of weight and heft to have in your backpack. And it also is going to take you extra time every time you want to go set that up and put that filter on. Yeah. So there certainly are drawbacks to having that bulbous front lens element, but oftentimes that's the only way you can get one of those ultra wide angle type of lenses. The other thing that you did mention, Juan, is that, with the zooms versus primes, the prime lenses are faster. We're not talking fast as in like focusing speed, but we're talking about fast as in what is the max aperture that it can give you. So if you really want like that f1.2 or f1.4 and get like the super creamy backgrounds and really, really shallow depth of field, then yeah, you're going to want to consider shooting more with primes than you would with the zoom lenses.
Right. And also, weight is another consideration there, right, as well with zooms. So zooms will end up being bigger and heavier than primes because primes are just trying to, to shoot at one focal range. So you can end up with, pretty small lenses in that scenario versus the zoom. So again, something else to consider as well.
Exactly.
So on the long end, and this is kind of my cup of tea, I tend to gravitate towards the long lenses. One of the advantages of the long lenses is a shallow depth field. A lot of folks, kind of say, well, that's the problem with long lenses. And to me, that's an advantage. I think the shallow depth of field allows me to add more depth and dimension to my subjects as I'm shooting them. It separates them from the background, especially when I'm shooting subjects that are kind of further away from me. So that's part of inherent of the long lenses in that they do have a shallow depth of field. That's compensated to a certain extent by the distance from your subject that you're shooting on. And if you have questions about that, we have another episode. I forget which episode number it is, but we do have an episode of the Images in Focus show where David and I discuss all about depth of field. And it's actually a really good episode. I encourage you guys to check it out. So consequently, because you're using these long lenses, you also will have a narrow field of view because you're zooming in or you're using a telephoto lens that's zooming in onto your subjects. Whether these are zoom or not, even when they're prime, you still have a very narrow field of view. The one disadvantage of the long lenses, as far as, for my style of photography, is that oftentimes they have very distant minimum focusing distance, meaning that, some of these lenses, if closest you can focus, maybe 4 feet, 3 feet, 5 feet out. And you're wondering, why does that matter if I'm shooting a long lens? Well, guess what? Because you may be able to use that lens to kind of shoot up close wildlife or macro. For example, I love dragonflies, I love butterflies, and oftentimes if I have a lens that is that has a far minimum focusing distance, I may not be able to photograph a dragonfly nice and up close. If we compare, just to give you a concrete example, we showed earlier the Sony 100 to 400 versus the Sony 200 to 600. The 100 to 400 focuses remarkably close, and I can use that as a, quote unquote macro, almost a macro, if you will, when I'm out in the field, if I want to shoot a subject that's really nice and close, a small subject. Whereas the 200, 600, I can't do that as much because I think the minimum focus and distance of that is like 5 feet long. I can't remember the exact numbers, but it's not very conducive to that, close shooting in close quarters. But another advantage is because we're shooting now in very long focal lengths, we have very little distortion on these lenses. We don't encounter much pin cushion or barrel distortion with these lenses.
And that makes them perfect. I would just say, like, with the minimal distortion, it makes them perfect for doing like panoramic stitching and stuff like that. It just stitches very nicely and evenly in post. The last thing I would just say is don't forget the middle focal range. That all-purpose focal range, kind of like that 24 to 105 millimeter. And I've had people show up on workshops and they just have wide angles and telephotos. And they end up missing so many shots in the middle because that was the focal range that we needed for those type of scenarios.
Yeah, to me, that the 24-105 is if I could only have one lens, if I was stranded on a desert island, I could only have one lens, that would be the one, because it is a very versatile lens. And something else to keep in mind too is that, we can make, if you will, our lenses, even if we don't have the right long lens or the right short lens, there's things we can do to compensate for that, right? Easiest thing to think about is, cropping. If you, wanted to reach out and grab something that's a little further out, but your lens is not long enough, you can simulate a longer lens by cropping, right? Or using, a teleconverter is something that we're going to talk about a little later on. So that's certainly a possibility. Or if you're using a camera with a crop sensor as well, that has the effect of multiplying your focal length.
Or if you can't go wide enough, you can just do a panoramic stitch and then put that together later in post.
That's right, absolutely. I like the fact that you mentioned using long lenses for panoramic stitches, because I see that quite often, that people will tend to grab a wider angle to then shoot a panorama. And yes, you can definitely do that. And the software nowadays is good enough that will actually, they will change your images in order to, correct the distortions that the wide angle lenses will do. But guess what's happening there is that you are reducing or decreasing your image quality when those images need to be distorted by the software, whether it's Photoshop or whatever else you may be using to stitch those. So the longer, the longer lenses are going to give you a much better stitch, much cleaner and much better image quality at the end. I typically, I like to shoot panoramas usually at about 100 millimeters if I can. Do you agree with that, or do you use longer?
Oh, I definitely agree with that. So that's probably the focal range where I shoot most of my panoramas is like 80 to about 120 millimeters.
Right. Yeah, I'm with you on that one. Same thing. I just find that when you end up doing the stitch, you see that that Photoshop or Lightroom hasn't had to do a lot of bending to the image to actually make it stitch right. So
exactly.
very cool. Okay. So, but one of the challenges, or the biggest challenge to long lenses, is the size and bulk of these things. In addition to the price, they can be exorbitantly expensive. And I have seen many people in the past where they went out, saved a lot of money, and they plunked down, almost a house down payment on a big long lens, and then they come back and say, this lens is not a sharp. I cannot get sharp images out of this lens. Well, it's just not about buying the lens. You have to learn how to use a long lens. Using a long lens, we're talking about 600, 500, 600 millimeters, even 400 millimeters. They can be a challenge to use. First, they can be difficult to find your subjects in them. When you're looking at a subject and you lift that camera up to your eye, finding that subject in the lens can sometimes be difficult. So you need to learn. There's techniques in order to help you do that. Plus, also holding that lens, when that lens is so heavy, holding that lens steady enough can be a challenge as well. So that's why you want to use a support system, if at all possible, for these very big, heavy lenses, because it's going to allow you to grab those better, sharper images. If you're shooting at slow shutter speeds with a 600 millimeter lens that you're hand holding, and this thing weighs, 8 pounds, well, guess what? The chances of you getting sharp images is going to be very low. In a situation like that, you either need to increase your ISO so you get a much faster shutter speed, or better yet, use a support system by connecting the tripod and the support system they're using to the foot of the lens itself, not to the camera. You don't want the camera you don't want that lens cantilever in the camera. You want to put the lens on the support system itself. And we're going to have another episode in the very near future on support systems, on tripods and gimbal heads and all sorts of other stuff. So we won't go too much into detail there, but something to keep in mind is that just because you bought that super telephoto lens, that's not the end of it. You have to learn how to use it in order to get the most out of it. So apertures, this is another very important consideration when you're trying to select a lens. How fast or how slow that lens is. What range of apertures does that lens provide to you, and what are your needs for apertures? If you're shooting astrophotography, you're going to want a faster lens, one with a wider aperture to capture that low light of the stars. Now, as a general rule, prime lenses will give you a faster aperture or a wider aperture. So that's another consideration we want to think about. When you're talking about zoom lenses, in general terms, you end up with slightly smaller apertures or slower lenses. And this aperture is controlled by the aperture blades in your lens. The number of blades that are there will also affect all sorts of different things that we're going to be discussing. So why don't you tell us about that a little bit, David?
For sure. So, this is enough material for the first episode on our lenses, but in the next episode, we're going to dive deep and start talking about these other considerations, things like bokeh, Sunstar quality, flare control, all the different image quality considerations that you have when looking at lenses. So make sure that you subscribe to our channel. Hit the like button if you found this video to be informative. Make sure you share with your friends. Jump on board with us on Facebook with our Images in Focus group, where you can share images, ask questions, and interact with the community. And most importantly, stay tuned for the next episode, where we're going to really dive deep into the next level of lens considerations.
See you in the next one.